Bore da, croeso, good morning and welcome to Chambers Wales webinar on why net zero is good for business. My name is Professor Paul Harrison. I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Innovation and Engagement at the University of South Wales. My background is in compound semiconductor optoelectronics, but in more recent times, got more involved in sustainability for the university, and we lead research projects in hydrogen technologies, battery technologies, anaerobic digestion. I'm joined today by four panelists who are Randall Edwards of Aspen Waite, Rob Allison of Auditable, Howard Gray of Business Consulting, and Catherine Westerby for the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, otherwise known as BEIS. So the session is a Zoom webinar, so you can see us, but we can't see you. We encourage attendees to use the chat function to share contact details and make comments. If they would like to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function. We have had some questions submitted before today's webinar, and we'll do our best to work our way through those. If we don't manage it during today's live session, and we'll try and send you written answers afterwards. So net zero is a phrase that you will have heard a lot of by now. The Welsh Government target is that by 2030, the public sector will be net carbon zero, and many big corporates have set similar targets. This will have a huge impact on SME businesses, whether they know it or not. Getting to net zero in the future requires action now so you don't fall behind. Starting your net zero journey can seem daunting, but Chambers Wales, as well as other organisations, are here to support your journey through events like this today. Today's event focuses on why this should be a priority for all businesses, the benefits of reducing your carbon footprint, and how it can boost your business, as well as helping towards national and global net zeros. So my first question to kick us off is to Howard. And the question to Howard is, Howard, we hear much around net zero and carbon neutral. What is the difference between these two, and why is reaching this important?
Excellent. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Paul. So very quick introduction. My name is Howard Gray. I work for CGI, and I lead our Sustainability and Climate Change Advisory team. So working with clients, SMEs, but also large clients across the public and private sector, helping them quite simply navigate a path to net zero. And appreciating the question, Paul, there is, around sustainability, there is plenty of jargon that we're all faced with, small business, large business, including terms like net zero, carbon neutral, climate positive, all of these things. But I think today we're just going to focus a little bit on net zero. And quite simply, net zero is to effectively reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and ensure that any ongoing emissions are balanced by removals. So I suppose what that means more broadly is that the IPCC set or concluded that there is a need for net zero CO2 by 2050 to remain constant within 1.5 degrees. And you hear this 1.5 degrees global warming temperature. So this is about individually and collectively as organisations, as SMEs, as government, and UK PLC has set a target of net zero by 2050. Paul's already mentioned Wales have set a target for public sector of 2030. And for example, NHS England have set a target of 2040. So what that effectively means is organisations are plotting a path within a time frame to effectively focus on reducing, so understanding their carbon emissions, understanding their carbon inventory and their impact, setting a path to reduce those, but being realistic that at some stage in the future that you're going to need to look at some activity to mitigate. So net zero is not about an absolute zero. It's about reduce over a period of time, and then effectively engage in certified schemes to look at offsetting any residual you have at the end. Carbon neutral, on the other hand, is something that could be achieved sooner. And carbon neutral is effectively thinking about the emissions of your organization and taking action now to effectively balance those with schemes. And important to say, those schemes need to be certified schemes. There needs to be a management of those schemes. So carbon neutral could be seen as a step on the journey towards net zero, but carbon neutral doesn't automatically guarantee that you're undertaking lots of activity to reduce your emissions. So the important thing here is net zero, which over a period of time, you reduce, and then offset any residual emissions. Whereas carbon neutral could be a step on that journey, whereby you get to a point where you say an intermediate step where at this point in time, everything we are generating in terms of a carbon inventory, we are balancing with accredited schemes. So carbon neutral, to summarize, carbon neutral can be seen as a step on the journey to net zero, but the important thing is net zero rather than carbon neutral.
Thank you, Howard. I'll now turn to Rob. Rob, if you could start by introducing yourself, and really we're interested in, it's not, the question is not just why net zero, but very much why now. What's your perspective on that?
Thank you, Paul, and hello everybody. As Paul says, Rob Allison. I'm a director with auditable. We specialise in cost, purchase, and carbon solutions for clients of all shapes and sizes, with our Welsh team headed by David James and Hugh Williams down in the south of Wales. Really good question as to the why now. I mean, I first looked at emissions within procurement some 15 years ago, and at the point then, trying to be environmental in the way you ran your business, trying to be conscious of your emissions and doing something about it was cost prohibitive for most. There was always a significant premium being paid by organizations if they went the green option. There's no doubt, through a combination of market forces, increased volumes, government action, we've passed the tipping point in the UK now. We're seeing in businesses every day decisions to be more environmentally aware when people are buying or using things in the way they operate their business is now beginning to actually be commercially sensible for them. We had an example just recently with one of our clients in South Wales where they were looking at their waste stream and just looking at trying to make that a more environmental solution, trying to reduce their carbon emissions in waste disposal. They were a paper products company. They rechanneled that waste through a series of different recycling programs and an energy to waste scheme. They achieved their objective. They reduced their carbon emissions on waste by some 97%, a staggering figure. But more importantly, on what was a circa £100,000 a year spend on waste disposal, they reduced their cost by 44%. So taking the green options in this day and age is a commercially sensible step that we believe businesses could make. And that's just one example of the why now argument that comes into play for us. It makes sense.
Thanks, Rob. I'll turn now to Catherine, if you can start by introducing yourself. And the question that we have for you is, can you give us an idea about what the government is doing to encourage SMEs to adopt net zero practices?
Definitely. Morning, everyone. Morning, Paul. My name's Catherine Westerby. I'm the Net Zero Business Engagement Lead at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. As Paul said, we normally call that BASE. And my job is to engage predominantly small and medium-sized enterprises on what net zero means. I suppose before we can start explaining what the government's doing to support businesses, we really do, the first step is obviously to make it quite clear what net zero is, and Howard has obviously given us an overview of that already. So it really is just sort of talking about the benefits of net zero to business. Again, just making it absolutely clear that there's a sort of a communications exercise here where we really do need to reach out far and wide to small businesses to really explain what net zero is and again, the benefits that it will have for their business. And this is what we did in the year to COP. So we led a campaign targeting small and micro businesses in particular. That was led by our net zero business champion, Andrew Griffith MP. Again, from November 2020 to November 2021. And we used that campaign to reach out to every part of the UK to engage small businesses on net zero. So the way that government stepped in to support small businesses was primarily by creating an information resource, a web page where we sort of drew together existing information, existing resources, because it can be terribly confusing. You know, there are so many websites out there, so many different resources out there. It is really tricky for a small business, especially one who doesn't really, you know, understand what net zero means at this stage or what it means for their business. It was really important that we create this website to sort of create a sort of one-stop shop advice service for small businesses, or at least start the process of creating such an advice service. So this website again has case studies, it has information on what net zero means in really clear and simple language. It has a list of suggested actions, for example, and importantly, most of those actions are designed to be cheap, to be quick, to be simple. It's not about expecting small businesses to fork out loads of capital that we appreciate many don't have at this stage. So again, we thought it was really important, again, just to sort of set the scene for net zero, to explain what it means, to start that conversation with small businesses and just make it as clear as we possibly can, you know, what it is that the government is asking businesses to do, what's in it for those businesses, you know, what's in it for them as a small business in particular, and how we're going to support them to do that. So again, that website points to plenty of tools and resources to measure your emissions, to manage your emissions, and you know, funding and other information options are on that website as well. So I will post a link to that in the chat. It's called the UK Business Climate Hub. It sits on the SME Climate Hub, which is part of the Global Race to Zero, which was the big global campaign ahead of COP26. So that's still running, the website's still running, we're still pointing small businesses towards it. And the one thing that we do ask all small businesses to do is to step up and make a commitment. So the one thing we'd like businesses to do is to join the Race to Zero, to join the 2,800 other small businesses across the UK who've done the same, to make that commitment. And that then again gives them access to our newsletter, it gives them access to other tools and resources that may be helpful to them. So again, I'll post a link in the chat, but hopefully that's a good way to start.
Catherine, thank you. And it preempted my question. It sounds like a very useful website for businesses. So I think the attendees would appreciate having that link in the chat. So thank you. We'll move now to Randall. If you could introduce yourself, Randall. And the question to kick things off is, what's the relationship between transitioning to a green economy and shareholder value?
Okay, thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone. My name's Randall Edwards. I'm a chartered accountant, former corporate finance partner for PricewaterhouseCoopers. I now head up corporate finance activities for Aspen Waite. But on the other side, I chair a business, Egnidar Consulting, that helps larger businesses and enterprises transition to a green economy. And I brought that element of experience to Aspen Waite, where we've developed a SME focused product doing the same, effectively helping SMEs transition. So I've got quite a unique experience in that I'm heavily involved in corporate finance and heavily involved in transition in businesses, which is why this is a, you know, for me, this is a good question. And actually, the things now are inextricably linked, and the reason why they are, and for example, a lot of you on this webinar and the panel will know who Mark Carney is, who's the former chairman of the governor of the Bank of England, was now a climate change czar. And with his glass, his half full lens, he's saying, and I agree with this, and I've seen this firsthand, that businesses that are part of the solution in terms of decarbonising the UK economy will do very well. So if you're part of the solution, you're going to do very well. And the second part of that is that businesses that do nothing are not likely to be in existence in 10 years' time. And I agree with that as well. And for this is an SME-led discussion, but from the SME's perspective, if you're owning a company, involved in a company that is in a larger business's supply chain, or wants to borrow money, or relies on procurement and tenders for its to attain its business, then quite simply you cannot afford not to be transitioning, because there is no legislation at the SME level for you to manage, report, verify your emissions, but this will be forced by larger corporates on the SME sector. Now, the reason why it's linked is that from a shareholder value perspective, and this is where I'm advising businesses from a corporate finance perspective, I am making sure they're on the green transition horse before I even, for example, try and sell them. Because there is a massive premium that can be achieved by being the first in your sector or micro sector or geographic sector to transition. And that premium can be huge. I'm involved in a business at the moment. It's in quite a difficult sector to decarbonize. And the economic value of that business, back in the day when I was a partner in PricewaterhouseCoopers, we used to do lots of share valuations. The economic value of that business is probably only a third of its strategic value now to somebody else, a larger organization, that for them, that business will be part of their solution to decarbonize. So the point being, if you can get first mover advantage, you can obtain a significant premium. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Rand. I'd like to ask a follow-up question to that. Do you have any specific examples of companies that have made this move towards greenifying their operation and have gained competitive advantage by doing that? Well,
I think, right, I got to be a little bit careful because of the sector I'm working in, I have to sign NDAs on most of the clients. So I'm not about there to go and tell you, what's the secret ingredient for Coca-Cola. But there are plenty of businesses in South Wales, for example, because this is a South Wales Chamber-led event, that are on this horse. And there's businesses in very difficult sectors that are leading the way in South Wales. You've only got to Google it, have a without me telling you and signposting exactly what those businesses are. But some are in very difficult sectors like heavy goods vehicles, for example. Okay, traditionally a nightmare sector to decarbonize, and I'm sure Charlotte will tell you a huge contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, in the UK. But they are. Businesses in that sector are decarbonising when others are just waiting for hydrogen to become a thing. But they are losing their competitive advantage by sitting, waiting. So I can't give you specific examples because contractually I can't. But there are plenty of them, and there are lots of companies now in the SME sector that have woken up to this.
Thank you, Randall. Howard, can I bring you in on that one?
Just building on what Randall said, then I think it's a couple of things. He's absolutely right. Then the opportunity for organisations, particularly SMEs, to become a more responsible and sustainable business, will give them a value to shareholders, a value to stakeholders. But more broadly than that, organisations that think about their impact as an organisation from a sustainability perspective tend to grow quicker, and they tend to be more innovative. And there's lots of evidence to suggest that. So, if we look at this why net zero for business, we've talked about the value that you can create within an organization and the value you can drive through an organization in terms of growth, in terms of innovation. I think there's a couple of other things as well. We've already talked very briefly about the net zero ambition of public sector in Wales by 2030. If you think about your clients, if you think about the questions you're probably now getting from your bigger clients, from public sector, they may be asking you about, let's see, there's a question there for ISO 14001. They may be asking you what your plans are. CGI as an organisation, we do, very proud of the work we do across the public sector in government. There's a couple of things we're seeing being cascaded through government now, which Catherine obviously would be very aware of. The first was for central government contracts, a change in the procurement note, which means they're now asking about social value. So 10% increasing of the award of a tender is based on an organisation's response to social value. So what do you give beyond performing your duties under the contract? What more do you give? What do you give around education? What do you give back to the community? What do you do around helping the UK recover from COVID has been one of the themes that's been talked about as well. So that's the first part. The second part is introduced last October, that every large piece of government procurement over £5 million, you now have to produce, to bid for that work, you now have to produce a carbon statement or a carbon reduction plan. That 5 million is a quite a big threshold, of course, but I can only see that threshold coming down over time. So the first reason to do this is beyond it's the right thing to do. The first reason to do this is to think about those questions you're now getting for clients. It enhances the value of your proposition as and when you talk to your clients, and you're going to increasingly be asked those questions. Second part that Randall's already mentioned is about increasing the value of your organization, the value of your business. And the final part is, which I think is really interesting, and we're certainly seeing within CGI now, is if I think about my son who's 16 years old, he knows more about waste and recycling in the environment than I ever did at his age. This is my employee of tomorrow. This is your employee of tomorrow. And we're now seeing it through our recruitment in, you know, what can be quite a challenging time for recruitment on a war on talent, that actually young people, that next generation of our employees of tomorrow coming through, yes, they want to understand about how much they get paid and how much holiday and what working hours are and whether the coffee machine's any good. But they also want to know they're working for an organization that takes its responsibility seriously. And we're seeing that increasingly, those questions coming through. So actually, it's about not just increasing the value of your business, making you more attractive in terms of client propositions, but it's also about making you an employer of choice as well. In you know, what is a tough world for recruitment currently. So lots of good reasons to do this, and you know, I'm sure there's other examples across the group.
Thank you, Howard. Catherine, you'd like to come in?
Yeah, just to build on what Howard was saying, again, there are plenty of benefits to small businesses, and the way that we're sort of, you know, describing those benefits and making them come to life is obviously through our case studies. Again, they're on the website. I've posted a link to another one in the chat, and I think again a really important point is exactly the one that Howard raised, which is, you know, there are regulations coming in that are affecting at the moment, you know, predominantly larger companies, large corporates, multinationals, etc. We've got the task force on climate related financial disclosures, for example, which came in recently, mandating again climate risk disclosures from the largest listed companies. So it is absolutely essential that small businesses sort of understand the direction of policy in this space, and that's again where government needs to step in and provide that direction to say, look, this is what's coming further down the line. We may be introducing tighter regulations at some point in the future on energy performance certificates, for example, on heat and buildings, for example. So there's lots of other policy areas where again regulation may be tightened in future. This is the time to start looking at net zero, to understand what it means for you as a business, to start measuring and managing your emissions. And that can be done very simply by installing a smart meter, you know, which is obviously, you know, probably one of the most cost effective things that a business can do, is simply to install a smart meter and to understand exactly, you know, where their emissions are coming from at this stage, you know, when their sort of peak usage is, exactly all of that's really sort of simple information that any business can do, that doesn't take much time at all. And again, it gets you ahead of the curve. We've been talking about this, but I think, again, it's really important that small businesses are aware of this and see the benefits, and again, take that first mover advantage, because as I say, these large companies, you know, especially if you're part of a large supply chain, are going to start pushing these requirements further down. If they have to meet net zero requirements, then smaller businesses in the supply chains are going to have to. So obviously we need to work with those companies to make sure that they're providing the right advice and guidance to small businesses. We don't want to make sure that we don't want to have a situation where small businesses, for example, are penalised, you know, and are forced into a situation where they have to start addressing their emissions and producing carbon reduction plans. So again, it's really, really important that businesses have access to this information now and can plan ahead.
Thanks, Catherine. So there's a role, isn't there, for legislation and encouragement by the government, local authorities and the devolved powers. And there was a live question earlier around this ISO 14001, and does that have a role to play in net zero? Is anyone able to expand on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So absolutely, ISO 14001 does have a role to play. I think it's like everything with sustainability. There's 101 things you could do as an organization, and one of the first things we would do with a client is something that we call materiality. And materiality is really working with that client to understand their business and to really make sure that you're not looking at 101 things, you're looking at those 4 or 5 things that give you the biggest impact and most quickly. And for some organizations, that will be ISO 14001. And you know, it's important ISO 14001 stays relevant. It's been around a while and continues to develop. But for many organizations, depending on you know, the purpose of the organization, perhaps if you're manufacturing, or, you know, perhaps running a contact center, then there's many good reasons still to bring in the discipline that having an environmental management strategy within your organization, and backed by ISO 14001, still has value. It may not be appropriate for everyone, and it's a case of doing it at the right time. What we do see is, particularly with tender documentation, because of perhaps sometimes a lack of understanding on those running the procurement, you'll often have a box on there that says, have you got ISO 14001? It's a very binary, tangible thing that they can say, have you got it, have you not? They don't have to then think about the quality of a response. It's a very kind of, have you got it, have you not got it? So I think as long as you're doing it for the right reasons, as long as you're as an organization, you've got, you know, from the leadership of the organization, all of the right reasons to be committing to 14001, and it is a commitment, it does need work, and it is about continuous improvement, then for many organizations, I still think it can bring value, yes.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you to Phil Summers for submitting that question. If anyone else in the audience has a question, please do forward it to us. So we've heard that, you know, regulation is an important part of it, and there are competitive advantages to be had out of moving towards net zero. So on that basis, I'd like to move to Rob and ask, so what are the reasons then that some businesses have not already started this journey, which is apparent from the need for this webinar this morning?
Yeah, again, another really good question, one we get involved a lot with in conversations. The single biggest obstacle I think that we see in everyday conversations is confusion. It is this, I mean, it's been alluded to by, I think, every one of the other speakers today, the myriad of terminology, the variations in standards. Different industry associations have their own standards and schemes that they're aiming for. And it does lead to almost a blizzard of activity and people almost reacting to that with paralysis, not knowing where to go or what to do as a result. So simplification is probably the first step in the journey. And I think, you know, it was Howard talked really well to the point that sometimes net zero, carbon neutrality can be a stepping stone towards net zero. We've certainly seen that resonate with a lot of audiences, where the idea of achieving possibly, say, a BSI, the PAS 2060 specification on carbon neutral, so that they are making reductions within that carbon neutral definition and then having it verified by a suitable party. It's a good stepping stone and simplifies the process towards net zero. The other factor for many when we talk about net zero, a lot of people in conversations see it as a long finger job. It's something that's a long way into the future. You know, the government itself is quoting 2050. We can deal with that next year, the year after. We've got more pressing matters right now. But again, you come back to the points that, you know, Randall and Catherine, everybody's made today. It is pressing today. You need to start on this journey, and it's not going to be an overnight journey. Catherine talked about starting with simple areas like energy management and being aware of energy consumption. Most businesses are going to start to have to account in much more detail for scope 3 emissions, you know, supply chain based emissions of their own. Their clients and customers are going to be asking for that data soon. And by soon, I mean in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. If they don't start putting in place data collection processes now to manage scope 3 emissions, as well as the slightly easier to get your hands on scope 1 and 2 data, they're going to face problems. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't do it, but I think they are far more outweighed by the reasons why they do need to start the journey now, even if it's only a partial step on that road.
Thanks, Rob. You've frozen for me.
Sorry, how's that?
Still back. Yeah. So you mentioned scope 3 emissions relating to supply chain, Rob. Can you just expand on what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions are, and where you think?
Yeah, yes, certainly. Very, very simply, and you could see the logic as to why these definitions were created in the initial stages. people, when they look at their own entity, their business, their organization, they look at their direct or more immediate emissions, things that they directly produce themselves internally within their operations. So their direct process-based emissions, their, maybe if they own company vehicles of their own, the direct emissions, that things that they have are burning fossil fuel and producing an emission. That becomes their scope one. Something that's right there in front of us, manageable, conceivable, and something we can get our hands on as a business, is what the way you look at it. They then said, okay, well, we can go a little bit wider than that and say, actually, there's another source of fossil fuel-based emissions that is really relevant to most organizations or most entities, and that's the energy that they consume. So where the fuel is burnt elsewhere to produce the emission, but the energy that comes out of that is piped into the organization. That's predominantly your electricity, but it could be steam or heat being pumped in from another system. That is your scope 2 emissions. And most organizations have started, certainly at the higher end of the marketplace, larger corporates, to really get a handle on scope 1 and 2 for obvious reasons. What they then turn to is the everything else, the bucket that is called scope 3 emissions. There's 15 subcategories within it. I won't go into all the detail, but the most obvious and pressing for most is that it covers supply chain. All of the goods and services used within the organization get captured within scope 3. And that's where many small businesses are now feeling that pressure, because the larger corporates, the large food retailers, Tesco, Sainsbury's, they are all now beginning to turn their spotlight onto scope 3 emissions. And as a result, they are issuing communications down their supply chain. Those suppliers in turn are now needing to start to look at their emissions. And if they then start to get into scope 3, they turn around and look at their suppliers. So you're getting that ripple effect coming right the way through, because scope 3 for many organizations is where the majority of emissions sit. I read an article in the Lancet, it was the NHS were quoted as something in the order of 63% of their emissions actually sat within scope 3. Microsoft are quite often quoted at 65% of their emissions sit within scope 3 or supply chain. So that's your demarcations of different areas of emissions. And you have to get your head around all of those if you're going to properly conduct a carbon inventory, properly understand where the material emissions of your organization lie.
Paul, can I just add something on that? Please. Sorry, it's Randall. I absolutely agree with what Rob is saying. And interestingly, we're doing some work indirectly with Tesco, and 90% of their carbon emissions is scope 3, just to sort of validate what you were saying, Rob. I think the other thing that people realize is just how far-reaching scope 3 is. And again, with my corporate finance hat on, for banks, private equity, scope 3 includes the carbon footprint of all the businesses they're lending money to and investing in. So very soon, and this is already happening. In fact, I think we've got somebody on the webinar from HSBC, and I noticed HSBC have got a banking product out there where there is an aspect of sustainability and carbon built into their product. But this is the way the world is going, because those banks and financial institutions are recognizing that the businesses they're investing in, their carbon footprint is coming onto their disclosure reports. So they are, the money is going to start forcing change. So again, SMEs looking to raise money, looking for access to finance, can't afford not to decarbonize.
Yeah, it's an important point. Yeah, thank you. Howard.
Yeah, I think just to agree what Rob's saying, I think capturing a carbon inventory can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. And I think, to bring it back to something quite simple, then, you need to be thinking about scope 1. So the fuel that you burn effectively. So if you have a fleet of vehicles, it's the fuel you're purchasing. Scope 2, which is often for many organizations, SMEs, the electricity you're purchasing. And you always look at scope 1 and scope 2, and then begin to think about the elements of scope 3 that are material to your business. So if I think about CGI, then we have a relatively small fleet of owned or leased vehicles. So our scope 1 is relatively low. Our scope 2, which is our offices, so the electricity going into offices and data centers is more. But actually, as an organization of consultants, one of the biggest parts of our carbon emission in the UK is our business travel, which is part of scope 3. So I think it's for an SME, it's about making a start, and it's about looking at it in its simplest form. So not trying to make it too complicated, not trying to go too far into scope 3, which is, we're all going to have to talk about going forward. I think there's, how many categories there is, but I think it's about capturing scope 1, scope 2, and the parts of scope 3 that are A, relevant, and B, you can get your arms around. Because you can lose lots of time in scope 3, where actually it's better to just keep it simple, start with things you can do, the things you can capture. You will have fuel bills, you will have a travel management system perhaps that gives you information on how your people are traveling, be that train, plane, or by car. And you will have electricity bills. So, for some fairly basic information that you have around with you, you can establish a baseline carbon footprint, begin to think about where the emissions are being driven within your organization, repeating that measurement. And once you can measure it, you can begin to think about the steps you can take to focus on strategies that can reduce that basic carbon footprint for you. Keep it simple, but start and do something is probably the message.
And presumably there are things in scope 1 and scope 2 that you can have a very short payback time and will reduce your cost base. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. The fuel you're burning, or effectively the electricity you're buying, and I think we've already had some posted in the chat there. It's understanding, reduction strategies, investments, ROI, and investments for everything from solar PV to, a CHP plant to all kinds of other things that you can do within your organization, depending how important that is. If you're an SME that runs 3 or 4 relatively small offices, but have a team out and about on the road using fleet, then actually, the strategy might be for you to think about ensuring that all of the energy you purchase, all of the electricity you purchase is from renewable sources, and then focus on the fuel, the vehicles you're using, the fleet you're using, how they can be more efficient. And then you begin to go into things like, well, actually, what's the policy and procedure and practice that we can use? And for CGI, how digital can help move your people around more effectively to focus on reducing that particular part of your emissions. So yeah, it's getting started, getting the basics, having something you can then begin to target strategies against.
Thank you, Howard, much appreciated. So there's a question in the chat for Rob and Randall, so maybe if you have a minute while you can try and answer that while we go to Catherine. Catherine.
I was just going to say, I suppose all of this talk of scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, for some businesses might be easy enough to manage, I think, but especially for the small and micro businesses that we've been targeting as part of our Race to Zero campaign, it can be, again, a little intimidating, I suppose, to think, well, how am I possibly going to manage my scope 3 emissions? How am I possibly going to understand that? My supply chain is huge. It, potentially expands overseas as well. That can be quite daunting for a small and micro business who isn't really familiar with all of this. So what we've done is the SME Climate Hub, I mentioned, again, the international platform that's part of the UN's Race to Zero. They've partnered with Google to develop a new tool. So this will be available in spring, and all businesses have to do is enter their email address. So obviously we'd like them to sign up and make the Race to Zero commitment, of course, but they don't have to initially. So they'll have to input their email address, and then they will get access to this tool, which does all the measurement for them. The beauty of this is that it is incredibly simple. Businesses just have to provide some very, very basic data. Again, as Howard said, that many of them have already, in terms of utility bills, for example, etc. So things like that. So businesses, again, will be asked to input some very basic data, some very simple information. It goes into the Google-led tool. It will then come out with an understanding of that business's emissions depending on their sector, for example, and importantly, it will then suggest ways in which the business can reduce their emissions. Where are the high sources of emissions for them, for that particular business, and how can they go about doing it? And here's some tools and resources and advice on how best to address those emissions. So again, the tool is completely free. I think it's worth emphasizing that because, again, there are lots of companies out there, I think, who are providing other sorts of advice and resources. But I think, again, it's important to note that the SME Climate Hub, again, is a free resource. It will be providing a comprehensive emissions management tool that, again, is available to all UK businesses. So we would encourage businesses, again, to sign up now to the SME Climate Hubs. They get sort of forewarning of when that tool is going to be launched. We will, of course, be announcing it when it becomes available, but it's just really important, again, to focus on how easy and quick and simple this can be. And it doesn't involve, you know, sorting through years and years and years of data when, you know, again, these tools are going to be freely available.
Thank you, Catherine. There's a connection there with the question of Gavin Miller in the Q&A, which is that there's a tool and there's an ability to scope your emissions, but what about the accuracy and of that report, and is it in any way auditable? Because of course in this climate it would be advantageous for a company to you know, make themselves look more carbon neutral than they actually are.
I think that's where we point to the Race to Zero as the gold standard. You know, this is UN backed, it's science backed, it's backed, you know, the Race to Zero itself is an umbrella organization encompassing initiatives such as CDP, the Science Based Targets Initiative, the Business Ambition for 1.5, Exponential Roadmap. So these are international organizations that are, again, globally recognized as providing a robust process for joining the Race to Zero. It absolutely is a counterbalance to any greenwashing that's out there. So if you're a member of the Race to Zero, if you've signed up, again, you can put that on your email signature, you can put it on your website, you know, shout about it, tell other businesses about it, because this is how we're going to grow this movement, you know, this sort of green business movement that's going to, again, push against any greenwashing that comes from you know, any larger companies out there. You know, there are obviously people trying to make the most of what they're doing, but again, the Race to Zero is absolutely the gold standard that we want all businesses to trust and to be assured by. And again, any resources and tools that are on the SME Climate Hub have been verified by the teams at Google, by the international team behind the SME Climate Hub, and by our partnership with Oxford University as well. So again, rest assured that that's the way to go. That's the single thing we need businesses to do, is to en masse join the Race to Zero. And again, all of these tools are robust and verified by a panel of experts.
So there's a good follow-on question there from Donna Kenny in the chat. And it's around, you know, in the current economic climate with inflation, you know, 5.5%, and the cost pressures therefore on the supply chain and wages. How do SMEs prioritise reducing their carbon emissions, for example, or greenhouse emissions and their sustainability? Is there any help of public funds to assist SMEs on their journey to net zero? Catherine, I'll come to you first.
Yes, definitely. And again, I think we've all made the case very clearly that it's crazy not to look at this. You know, that it will cost you more as a business in the long term if you're not adapting now. And I think we're fully, you know, we fully recognise, having engaged constantly with small businesses for the last 2 years, it is absolutely essential, you know, that businesses understand what's in it for them. So that's again why we have case studies demonstrating that just perhaps a little bit of upfront capital can have a huge payback. You know, some companies, there's a coffee shop in Northumberland called Kariba Coffee that increased their customer base by 52% over a space of about 6 months, simply because they were promoting the fact that they joined the Race to Zero, and customers were attracted by this. They got more business, and again, they're looking to do even more with the increased revenue that they've got to feed that back into the business to fund greater sustainability improvements. So it's always the case, I think, that looking, you know, depending on your type of business, there will be a cost-effective way to start looking at your emissions. Again, you know, it is absolutely free to join the Race to Zero, to start that journey. I think, Paul, as you mentioned, this isn't about changing overnight, so we absolutely don't expect businesses to do everything all at once. There are going to be simple options at the very start of that journey. Again, I've mentioned, you know, installing a smart meter, for example, measuring and starting to manage your emissions, right the way to the other end of the spectrum where we have transport costs, for example. We wouldn't necessarily expect all businesses to swap out their entire fleet for electric vehicles at the moment. Clearly, that might not be a cost-effective option. However, when your lease is set to expire, perhaps in, you know, 2, 3, 4 years, you might want to plan ahead and look at, you know, at that point in the future, perhaps that's a cost that you could absorb. Perhaps that's a decision that you would want to make, which again would have a significant impact on your business emissions. And there is help available again from the Department for Transport. We've got the plug-in charging grant, the workplace charging scheme. Those links are available on the SME Climate Hub, so there absolutely is support out there at the minute that businesses can take advantage of to make those costs as minimal as possible.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, and there's some chat in the Q&A around you know, about, you know, funds to invest to greenify. So, for example, if you wanted to switch your fleet to electric vans, you know, there's a great capital outlay to start with a long payback time, and SMEs feel as though they would need help in that. But I think that's been answered in the chat itself. So I'd like to move now to some of the pre-submitted questions, if I may. And there was one from Paul Cleverley of Freight Logistics Solutions, and I thought Randall would perhaps be best placed to answer this. Randall, what role has the management of freight transport have in net zero objectives?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thank you, Paul, for the question. I've done quite a lot of work in this area, so the simple question is they've got a massive role to play, because particularly at the heavy goods side of freight, they're a massive greenhouse gas emitter, and I think it was Howard who's mentioned on several occasions the need to be innovative, and I think this sector has been significantly uninnovative, if that's a particular word, I don't know, but it sort of fits the bill as far as I'm concerned, because if you look generally, most of the large organizations in this sector are doing nothing, and what I mean by that is it's convenient for people to wait. Everybody's hanging their hat on hydrogen transport at that level because of the range, etc., and doing nothing because there's no real hydrogen HGV tractor units in the UK, and secondly, there's no hydrogen infrastructure. So I guess the people in middle management can tell the bosses we can't do anything yet because there's no infrastructure, there's no trucks. But the reality with the sector is you have to be more innovative, and you have to get one thing clear. And it's this: there is no one size that fits all in that sector. If you're just sitting there to have one technology that's going to be the answer to decarbonising HGV, then you're going to be waiting a really long time. You've got to be more creative than that. Businesses that we're involved in are already decarbonising. The fact of the matter is, you've got to understand your business. You've got to look at the profiles of your journeys, and there are already existing technologies out there that will suit chunks of your supply and your business already. You've just got, so simply waiting is not good enough. And my experience is this: customers, I think while we were talking about the large businesses looking at their supply chains, you mentioned purchased goods and services, of course, upstream, downstream, distribution is another big part of scope 3, big part, for example, of Tesco's. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, they will, in the right circumstances, they are looking for solutions to decarbonize their scope 3. So if you orientate your business to be a solution to the likes of Tesco or any large food corporate food retailer, etc., then they recognize that there are, for example, I don't know if people are aware, but the cost of a fully electric articulated lorry will be 4 times the cost of a diesel equivalent at the moment. But that doesn't mean to say that you cannot deploy it profitably within your structure, right? Because there will be chunks of business that you will be able to negotiate and you will be able to run, which will make those trucks viable now, because they are, and it's already happening. So the answer to the question is, you need to start, and you need to start now. Don't wait, because if you wait and you're not part of the solution, you're probably going to be struggling in 5 to 10 years' time, because other people will have leapfrogged you.
Thank you, Randall. I'd just like to correct you, though, when you said there's no hydrogen infrastructure in Wales. There's a small bit of hydrogen infrastructure. So University of South Wales runs a hydrogen refilling station in Port Talbot. Thank you.
But good luck if you're not operating out of Port Talbot, though. That's the problem. There's no real national hydrogen infrastructure. Right. It's probably I should have said, Paul.
The question will be whether demand produces supply, or whether it needs to be the other way around. Howard.
Yeah, just to follow on from what Randall said, we're doing quite a lot of work with a UK distribution organisation that have made a commitment to net zero, quite an ambitious commitment to net zero, and we're working with them currently. And you're absolutely right. There is, within a net zero plan, within a plan that projects for them net zero, there is things they can do today There is technology they know is on the horizon, and they're lucky in a way that they're of a size and scale where they have a really strong engagement with vehicle manufacturers. So they're working very closely. They're testing, they're trying new vehicles, and it's not just effectively the fuel of the vehicle, it's the refrigerants as well that they're using. So they're multi-chamber vehicles, but there is going to be an element of this where we, to plan a path to net zero and a trajectory to net zero for 2030, 2040 in their case, and given the fleet they operate, then that's a significant challenge for 2040. Then we will have to make an assumption that technology continues to progress at the rate it has done, and there's no evidence to suggest that's not the case. And hydrogen vehicles, whilst you may not be able to go out and buy one today that gives you everything you need, there does need to be an assumption with this based on what's coming from vehicle manufacturers and technology and breaking new ground. It's not just about what we know today, it's what we will expect to know over the next 5 to 10 years and be able to deploy in terms of vehicles, in terms of new technology. So it's all happening. There is lots of conversations happening with big distribution organizations and vehicle manufacturers and academic institutions to bring all of this together. And the government is obviously looking at its plan going forward. And I think there is a consultation currently happening, or will be happening soon, with National Highways or Highways England around what potentially freight logistics looks like going forward. But bear in mind there is a bit of a leap of faith, but an assumption in many net zero plans for especially logistics and distribution sector that technology will progress at pace, as it has done already, to help us deliver what we need to deliver over the next 15 to 20 years.
Thank you, Howard. I would like to move on to another question submitted before today's webinar. And the question's from Danielle and Robin, and I thought perhaps Rob Allison was the best person to attempt to answer this. So the question is, what are the steps and procedures for an SME to go carbon neutral? So if you're in an SME now, and you have an aspiration to be carbon neutral, how do you start? Where do you get help from? Okay, Rob.
Carbon neutral on its own, I think, can be a dangerous step, because it can be open to a lot of criticism if all you're doing in its purest definition is offsetting what you emit. There is a secondary level, if you will, to carbon neutral. We mentioned it earlier, a British standards specification, and that requires in order to call yourself carbon neutral under that, you've got to have made steps to reduce carbon year on year. So it's that stepping stone in the journey to net zero that we referred to. So if we're talking about that kind of a definition of carbon neutral, it's a simple process. Step number one, measure where you are today. Map the emissions in your organization and work out, the current footprint, the inventory, whatever term you want to put to it. Do that properly though. Don't take shortcuts on that too early on, because there's been many an organization have been caught out with claims later down the road if they haven't got the footprint right to start with. So set your footprint to start with. Step number two, look at all of the innovation and the actions that have been referred to throughout today's discussion. Do things that can decarbonize your own organization. Prioritize them, as Howard's alluded to, biggest impacts, easiest to implement, simple 2x2 sort of matrix to work out which ones you can get on with and make a difference. So you've measured, you've reduced somewhat. If you want to get verified as carbon neutral, the next step is offsetting, and for verification, you need to choose high quality voluntary offsets. So there's again a standard of definition to the offsets you can use at that stage. And then the final stage in that is you go and get a firm like BSI or NQA or any of the verification bodies out there, ideally one that's already been certified by UCAS, and you get them to check the definitions, you get them to check the boundaries of your footprint, you get them to check the calculations and the methodology that's being used. And if that all passes muster, you can then stand there really quite proudly with a badge of honor to have started your journey and achieved carbon neutral. But, and this is why personally I do like the past process, that's only a cyclical process over its period, so say a year. You then do the whole thing again with reset where your footprint is. Now you've reduced it a bit. Take more steps to reduce your footprint further, re-offset, retire those offset, re-verify. And that is the stepping stone, I would argue, towards this net zero journey, because as you then start to make those iterative year-on-year reductions, you end up with a target point in mind when you're going to hit true net zero. So carbon neutral to a verified standard, 4-step process, all starts with measuring your footprint.
Thank you, Rob. And actually, on that contribution, I think it's a good place to draw matters to a close today. So we've had a really interesting discussion this morning. We've had some great contributions from the floor, and the panel have been excellent in fielding the questions and actually putting over a compelling argument, which is quite inspiring for the reasons to move towards net zero. And the business benefits for doing that in terms of it's a way of driving innovation. There's a social responsibility card that can be played. It will fit in with future government procurement expectations and access to finance even. And all of these will help generate a competitive advantage for businesses that follow this route within the UK and abroad. So, for me, I'm certainly won over today, and I hope the attendees are similarly inspired. And there's much help out there for SMEs to engage with, as Catherine's given us that link to those web pages and the resources that are there. And indeed, the panelists themselves are all experts in this area and are in businesses, consultancy businesses, which are there to support businesses. So I found it inspiring today, and I'd like to thank you all for your time this morning and for engaging. And we hope to see you at the next Chambers Wales event. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.